wanted to discuss, which is that our objective is to get data comics to scale as much as possible. And one
Yeah.
part of the problem, of course, is how does one get comics into mainstream narrative, particularly with media, which is the, let's just say, the soft side of things. On the other hand, is the technology. What does it take to make it easier to create data comics? And
Mhm.
uh, we've been doing this for data visualization for some time now, pretty much following the principles of the grammar of graphics. And what that's enabled with the likes of libraries like Vega is that we can talk about the grammar of a data visualization in code through configuration. And it's effectively manipulation of that configuration programmatically that leads to a representation. And at some level, it makes reasoning about the output easier, not necessarily more intuitive, but programmatically easier.
Yeah.
Uh, so that got us to think, what does the equivalent of that look like for data comics?
Mhm.
Just swap out the visualization part and look at it from a comic perspective. So I guess we haven't been thinking about this from a research perspective as much as a practitioner's perspective.
Mhm.
And the simplistic view that we started off with is, let's define the components. And to us, a component is literally one comic character, which may comprise of subcomponents, each having their own state. So the head could be turned in different ways, have different expressions, the body could be pointing in different directions. That's what constitutes a character. Um, there are arguably many ways in which it could be split: a head, body, feet structure, a head, feet structure. And obviously, even this is oversimplified. But at least that kind of an approach seemed to make sense. We progressed a little further from that to say, why discrete elements? Why not continuous transitions, effectively like animating a face? So the emotion is something that could range from happy to sad based on the shape of the curve, and it could be continuous transitions and therefore parameterized variables that are categorical or continuous. Either way is fine. Uh, that's where we are and have been for some time now. What we haven't yet gone to is, what is the language or the grammar for putting that into a comic strip? That's something that we've been doing in a more creative way, but haven't gotten to any kind of structure, particularly when we think of it in the data comics context, meaning that the intent is to communicate data, and therefore, invariably, apart from verbal mention of data and insights from that, there's usually also charts associated with the comic. That's sort of the space where we were in, and we've been following your work for some time and finally mustered up the courage to reach out and say, well, let's just talk and share our work and learn what we
Yeah.
can.
Yeah. Um, well, that sounds all very interesting. So there's a couple things that come to mind in terms of projects that other people are doing that are at least similar or overlapping. I'm not sure if you're aware of work by Benjamin Bach.
Yeah.
So everybody's nodding very vigorously, which means, yeah. So I would think you would, because he's kind of the data comics guy at this point. And his work is obviously very relevant for what you're doing. There's also a project at the BBC that I had been collaborating with. So there's the BBC News Labs have various projects that are related to making news more accessible for people. And one project led by David Caswell there and Robert McKenzie, they wanted to create a way to automatically generate news comics. And they contacted me to essentially advise them on how to do this. And what they ended up building is so there's two parts to it. They have what's called a structured story template, which is essentially a template for the progression of the news story. And they have it's like basically slots you fill for different types of information. And they have, so, and it just guides you through a story. So it's something like introduce the story, what's the main issue, what are the supporting things, and then, so it's a basic just story template. And they have their journalists type into that template the basic story. And they're constrained right now to the health desk, so only health-related stories. And they started this before the lockdown and whatnot, but then, of course, it became even more relevant. And so they have the journalists type into this thing, and then they built an interface where they have a database of manipulatable images that they've created, which can combine with each other in unique ways. And they can be manipulated, so they can be rotated, resized, flipped, and different color schemes, things like that. And their library is, I think, if I remember correctly, something like 215 images. But if you do and a panel can get up to 3 of these components in it. And then they can combine. So if you did the full generativity of it all, if you had every single possible thing combined with each other in every possible manipulation, you get something like 2 billion possible panels. Of course, many of those panels would not make any sense if you have weirdly shaped, colored and backwards and oddly arranged things. But it's highly generative. And so what they then do is each of the components in the library has tags for different content. So what it does is it takes the text that the person types in and then pulls from the library to automatically suggest images to go with it. And it automatically generates these panels. And it can do it either by literal things. So, if you type in, if a sentence has something like corona, maybe it'll have a, little virus that it pops up into there. If there's numbers, it'll create a little chart as an example. Or it'll just have the number and say % really big. If it is about people, it will have shaded people of the number of people that are involved. So there's some basic data representation methods. But one of the things I told them to do, I hope they implemented this, but is they also have metaphoric frames for the content in the panels. So things like if you have in the database, you have storm clouds as one of the images in the library. Now, you could have storm clouds be pulled up by discussions of storms, by weather, by seasonal affect disorder, right? These are all things that could be pulled up within the health context, but also metaphorically for something like depression. So if you have depression, then the storm clouds might be there for depression as a metaphoric extension, and that's a common metaphoric frame. And so your library then increases its generativity by a lot because it can both convey the concrete things, but also more abstract things, drawing on known metaphoric frames. And as a result, they are able to now generate automatic news comics. And I know, I'm not sure if they're publishing them yet, but I know that they were just starting to get it off the ground. So it's should be appearing within the next couple months. I know that they're already generating comics using this system. So the sequencing in those cases is not derived from the properties of the visuals necessarily. It's guided by the story template, which is the text, right? The text you enter in. So the text-image relationships are always of images kind of elaborating or supporting the text rather than the other way around, for example. But that's just part of the system that they built such that the journalists can use this as a tool and relatively quickly create these things. And they've done pilot testing on all this stuff. Actually, several rounds of pilot testing, both in the UK and Indonesia was their international test location. And this is also with kind of they're targeting kind of underserved audiences. So typically people who don't read news very often, oftentimes who are less literate, less engaged with things. So a lot of that they do is they don't use layouts. So they have a layout version that generates as just a simple layout, but they also generate them as Instagram stories, where it's one image at a time, and you just swipe between each panel. So you get one panel, next panel, next panel, and it works fairly effectively. And the feedback they had was so positive that they thought the survey was broken. And people doubted that the survey was accurate. And so then they did it again and got the same sort of responses. In fact, they said that they'd never done a pilot that was so positively received.
Wow.
So they are very excited about this. And like I said, they're starting with the health desk, and then they might expand to other types of things. But like science communication, for example, would be a very easy, another kind of small, fairly constrained, sphere. And it depends on, of course, science is very big, but it depends on what sorts of topics you're targeting. You could, do a similar sort of approach where you have those sorts of generative components. Now, if you're breaking down people into, again, emotional states, you could then have those component parts as well. And it kind of goes back to all of this was kind of designed based on my theoretical architecture, in that, drawings are built up of basically visual vocabulary items. And so in our minds, when we draw, you're literally pulling up different, just like you said, like different lines of, mouths to convey different emotions. Those different curves correspond to different emotional states. And in fact, I teach a drawing class here at my university for kind of visual communication purposes. And yesterday we did faces. So it's very salient in my mind, doing like, okay, which eyes do you use for which emotions? Which mouths do you use? Things like that. And actually, what my students produce might be relevant for you, which is they produce their final project for class is to produce a comic that is a comic version of an academic paper. So they take an academic paper and they have to translate it into a comic and make it accessible for reading. And I post all of these on my website. Let me get the link for you. I think that's the link. Yeah. I'll just put it in the chat here.
Sure.
So this is so there's 2 years that I've done this now, and I tend to have a lot of students in my class. And so you'll see all of the ones that we've posted. And
Fascinating.
in those, you see that we post both the comic version and what the original article was. So you can kind of see where they came from. Different people take very different approaches in very kind of fun ways. Some people just take a very straightforward thing, like they draw the author guiding the reader as a narrator. Some people do something a little bit more abstract. Some people turn it into a little story. Some people do very creative, odd things, which I'm okay with, because it's as long as they are putting to use the lessons from the class. But they do some very interesting things with it. And these are just master students who do basically 6 weeks, 7 weeks of a course with me. And then they produce that at the end.
Got it.
And mostly what I'm teaching is just basic drawing skills. And then I have a lesson on sequencing, kind of narrative sequencing. and then a lesson on multimodality, on kind of how you pair text and image together and what are the effective ways to do that. And I should also say that the assignment for the creation of these comics is a little bit of a formal challenge. So I have a list of required things that they have to have in the comic. Mm-hmm. So they have to have one representation of perspective. They have to have different types of framing of panels. So one panel has to have just one character. One panel has to be a close-up. One panel has to have multiple characters in it. One panel has to have something that's not characters. Mm. There has to be at least one metaphoric panel. There has to be different types of text-image relationships. So in some ways, it's also kind of a formal exercise that forces them to like, well, not only do I have to draw this comic, but I have to draw it with all these specific formal elements inside of it. So they have, because that way I see that they're carrying out the things that they've learned in class. So there's some sort of formal challenges involved in it as well. Yeah, so those are the projects that come to mind immediately that might be of interest. So like, thinking about text-image relationships. Again, so think about sequencing. Mm-hmm. So sequencing, I have this paper called, well, it's a very technical paper called A Multimodal Parallel Architecture. That's a bit more, it's very linguistics, linguistic model. But the idea is that when you have sequencing with combining, when you have text and image combining together, mm-hmm. sometimes, as many other people have said, the text carries more meaning and sometimes the image carries more meaning. But what I wanted to point out was that sometimes you have different types of sequencing where sometimes the best way I can think about it is if you have like, sometimes the images are merely supporting the text, but the text is what is actually strung together. So I think about it like, imagine a string, and you have pearls on the string, but each of those pearls kind of has little hanging, dangling something off of it, right? In that case, the dangly things are the images, and the pearls are the text, and the string is the sort of discourse coherence. So in that case, what's being strung together is just the pearls, but the images are just kind of hanging off of that to illustrate what's on those on that text. You could also, of course, have the string through the images too, right? Just through those dangly parts. And then the pearls are hanging above it. I don't know if it would be above. Maybe the pearls are not, right? Or you have the string going through both, where you have both the text and the images are creating these sorts of cross-panel coherences. And it depends on how you're conveying that sort of message. So if you are, I generally find that the ones that have both are the most sort of cohesive and there's the most stuff that's going on and readable, but it's also the most demanding to read because then you're tracking meaning across both text and images. As opposed to if you have the text guiding it and then the images are supporting that text, you're able to kind of unitize the images more and just carry the text across. Or if you have the images carrying over and then the text is just supporting, you're able to kind of hold on to just the images and have the text be supplementing as part of that image unit. So it kind of depends on, usually what I say is it depends on what you're trying to convey. But if you are, putting a little bit more, if you want to be a little more dynamic, I would say definitely have the images have something tied together. A good example of this is just if you have a talking head where you have, they're saying stuff, and what they're saying is really the main components. Now, one option is you have just the head, and you just repeat the same character across panels over and over again. That ends up being fairly, less informative for the image, but also very non-demanding in terms of the sequencing. So if you just have the person themselves in different poses, now at least they're changing across panels. So it's a little bit more dynamic. Of course, it's not very informative because it's just a talking head. But if you imagine, say, an object that, I don't know, let's say the text is about, I don't know, animals or something, herd migration. I don't know. This is why I don't know why I picked that out of my head, but let's say it's herd migration, right? You could start off with an image talking about this, and you could have just pictures of animals in each one, or you could have pictures of those animals, say, going and doing stuff, and it will have text-image relationships. But let's say it's, you show an animal, and then it's taking off in flight, and then you show them traversing across some landmass. Now at least you have some sort of cohesiveness between the panels, where hopefully the text is still giving you the most of the information, but the panels are at least bound to each other. And if you compare that to something like a documentary, so oftentimes what I find on documentaries is that the images they show you are almost irrelevant a lot of times. Oftentimes, especially the lower production value documentaries, it's usually just a person talking, and then they show you semi-related images, but nothing that's directly conveying exactly what's in the text or enhancing, what's in the text. It's usually kind of visual filler until they get to something that they really want you to see. And then the images carry more weight. Otherwise, it's mostly just somebody talking with, some filler images. So I don't think that you can get away with the filler image stuff as much with comics, because you're much more unitizing each unit. So if you have just if you have something very descriptive and then you show, I don't know, an aerial shot of a landmass like they would do in a documentary, I think people would go, well, why is this image here? I don't understand what's going on here. It requires a bit more, sorry, lots of excitement going on over here.
No
All of a
worries.
sudden.
No problem.
It requires a bit more cohesion between the text and image, I think. You can't just have random stuff in images. I hope that's helpful. I don't know if that was me rambling a little bit.
No. Give us almost a masterclass of what you covered, and have a whole series of questions, as you might imagine. But let me pick a couple of themes, and Richie, I'm sure
Yeah.
some
Please
thoughts as
do.
well. What I got out of what you mentioned for BBC was that it's clearly generative characters. What I additionally took away is that there is a lot of power in tagging, particularly metaphorical. That's really strong.
Right.
What that allows us is the raw material to put together into a strip. What about, but then it's the job of somebody to lay them out in a given panel.
Yeah.
Are there, I don't even know what to call it, but are there generative layouts in the sense?
Good question. Yeah, so are there constraints on the layouts? I don't know. I would assume that they did something like, it depends on, I think that they have sort of a slot-based structure, so that if one component is generated, it takes the whole, frame. If two are generated, they're either next to each other or up above each other, something like that, or maybe at a diagonal. And then if three, they probably have slots that fill in some, but I don't think that they are doing things that are more complex than that, is my guess.
Got it.
I think that they're generally having certain slots. Now, of course, you could make generative layouts so that would be, templates, essentially, scene templates. So I can imagine quite a number of, things that you could do. You could do foreground, background. You could do with left versus right. It depends, how you do it. top, bottom. It depends how much you want things to overlap each other also. But clearly top, bottom next to each other, that's a 2-element thing. You could also think of, so one, I believe that I told them, so I came up with some scene templates when I was first working with them. So one, for example, was if you want to do a quotation or quote somebody, you of course are going to have character with balloon and then maybe description of who that is at the bottom. So that's a template I think that they're employing. You could also do a relational templates with certain types of representations of characters. So if you have a character who's doing this, then you have that person who's doing this, and then you have an open slot for whatever they're presenting, right? So if you have sort of, I was looking at some of your data comics. If you have like somebody who's presenting data, you could have it be like they do this, and then there's an open slot for where the data gets put, right? And that would be a scene sort of template that you could specify. And then you could also have it be the character gets specified too. It just is automatically in who is the character, what's the data, but it gets put into that template. And this is also true of like comics in general. So comics, I think people think of comics as every comic panel is a completely novel generated form. But in fact, there's many, many standard templates that comic artists use. Whether they know that they use them or not is an interesting question. I generally think that they don't necessarily know that they do it. It's just that it's part of their own mental vocabulary of their visual language. But if you go through comics, you can find very systematic types of panels, and they likely differ across cultures and whatnot, which is one of our big current focus in research. Is that we're doing corpus work, detailing comics from around the world and analyzing and annotating comics from around the world, including Indian comics. One of the ideas is looking for these sorts of standard templates. So some that come to mind from like American comics are there's a standard type where it's like a horizontal panel that just shows eyes in it. There's kind of a small vertical panel that just shows a single eye, often kind of a wide eye, like somebody is like, oh my God. And so it's just a single eye. There's a pretty standard panel from manga and anime where it's somebody reaching back to punch and their arm is kind of behind them like this. So it's the about to punch, often with kind of lines radiating off of the punch. And you'll find examples of this in lots of different comics if you actually are looking for it. So there are definitely standard templates of panels that have functional roles. Oftentimes in a sequence, has a functional role. So like reaching back to punch is always a preparatory action. That's an about to action that is going to be followed by some sort of climactic moment, typically the punch. So it plays a functional role in the sequence. The wide-eyed panel is often kind of a climactic moment. The zoomed-in eyes is, again, one of these preparatory things. It's usually this and then the climactic thing that they see. So there's various templated panels also. And you find this in movies and other things as well. So oftentimes people kind of pass these off as tropes, but they are often very systematized in the representation. So if you think about the one that I just put into a lecture about this topic, the person walking away from an explosion shot in movies is almost always the person who's walking towards you and to the left. And the explosion is to the back right.
Interesting.
Only sometimes do they go to the right, it seems. Much less common do they go to the right. You never see it from like an aerial shot where there's an explosion and then they're walking away. It's always kind of a low shot, person's to the left, explosion is back to the right. So there's a very clear compositional quality as a kind of lexical item to the way the shot is designed. That sort of template, whether the people who are aware of this or not, they probably call it okay, let's do the exploding car shot now or something. But they have a very particular way that this is now shot conventionally. And comic panels are often like this. There's still a lot of them that are very novel and generative, but there's also very clear templates that people can use. And if you're designing a system, you can design a system that will use that as well, of course. Use those templates.
Got it.
Yeah.
Another question that popped up as we were thinking about this, in fact, almost an extension of that question, which is generative layouts. Sure, we can create templates with slots. What about generative sequencing?
Yeah, so there's, so essentially what my theory is that all of visuals and work the same as language. It's all the same principles. And languages, essentially what you do is you encode different patterns that allow both for, there's a lot of slot filling, and those patterns can be more or less filled in. So, just from language, you can have examples of words that have, you have a single isolated word, you have words that have suffixes and prefixes. Some languages, the words themselves are not conventionalized, and they are only built of smaller pieces that are conventionalized. So languages like Turkish, the words are not actually conventionalized, and the conventionalized items can't be isolated. You must combine these conventionalized things to make novel pieces. Well, that's the way panels often work, because you have conventionalized parts that you build something novel out of. But you also might have larger pieces. Sentence structure is essentially slot filling of a grammatical pattern. So something like, subject, verb, object is a slots that are filled. That's a noun, verb, noun pattern. And then you can embed them inside. So you get sort of the hierarchy and generative nature of language with slots that are basically embedded into slot filling patterns that are filled into other patterns, which we call constructions. And but you might also have them that are partially filled in. So a good example is verbing the time period away. So twisting the night away, lounging the day away, sleeping the afternoon away. It always has the same pattern. And you always have to have the away part, and there's certain things that fill those slots. So that's much more specific than the noun, verb, noun pattern. But they all both use slots at different levels of generalness. And sequencing in visual sequences works the same. So there is there's different types of rules for visual sequencing. Some of my papers have outlined these. So the most general sequence is what I call the canonical narrative arc, which is the kind of what I call establisher, initial, peak, release, or it's kind of setup, initiation, climax, resolution. But unlike a lot of other sort of narrative theories, mine is fully generative. So inside of a setup, you can have a setup, initiation, peak, release, right? And then so it's fully generative and has all these different options for how you elaborate on each of those parts. In addition to that, there's modifiers. So modifiers do things like repetition of the same category, or you might have a modification of a category. So in language, something like an adjective modifies a noun, it elaborates on that noun. In visuals, you might have a representation of a person and then a zoom of that person. That zoom is simply modifying the more prototypical and informative representation of the full person. So that's a modifier. And of course, that then can be embedded within, so you have a setup that has a character, a zoom of that character, and then you go to the initiation. So you have it operating on different levels of sequencing. You also have, there's different ways of repeating the same function. So if you have, say, a scene that has two characters in it, the most simple way to do it is to show both of those characters in a single frame. And let's say that's the setup to some sort of initiation, right? But another way of showing that exact same information is now you break up that panel into two panels, where now each character has its own panel. And the way my grammar works is that it says that each of those panels plays the same functional role. And so both of those are now setups inside of a larger setup that then has initiation, peak, release event eventually. So it's hierarchic and then modifying. And you end up with, those are the most general patterns, the canonical sequence, say the modifier, and the, what I call conjunction, which is the same one repeated, the repetition one. Those, with just those three, you can create incredibly complex sequences that elaborate in lots of different ways. And on top of that, you end up with more idiosyncratic patterns. Things like subjective viewpoint shots, like point of view shots, are another type of pattern that use a type of sequencing pattern. And all of these are much more complex than I'm describing, and have a lot more ways in which slots get filled with a variety of different types of information. Yeah, you end up with these various types of sequencing patterns. So there's a couple papers of mine that describe this. Probably the best one, so there's one called Narrative Conjunctions Junction Function. Actually, I can, maybe easier is...
I can search for that. That's easy enough.
Yeah. Well, on my website, I can just grab some links for you, which is pretty easy. So here's one. This one describes the full architecture of the grammar, and it describes those three types of patterns. And then it also describes patterns that are created with those things. So you can kind of see how they generatively hook together.
Got it.
Into conventional patterns. The narrative conjunctions junction function. Narrative conjunctions junction function. That's it. That one was the first kind of. There's that one. That was the first description of conjunction in depth, and there I talk about the different types of conjunction that might operate. There's also a recent paper that I did about different techniques that are used to create inferences, so that make people fill in information. Again, there's very specific patterns that are used to motivate these sorts of inference generation. So the long answer to your question is that yes, there are sequencing patterns that are used, and those sequencing patterns are parallel to the layout patterns. So layout is essentially sequencing for just the visual information. These sorts of patterns are the patterns for the sequencing of meaningful information.
And what I take away from your words in parallel is that they are completely independent of each other. One does not influence the other in any way. Got it.
Well, they can intersect. So there might be conventional rules for, okay, when you want to show this thing, maybe a good way to do it is this thing. They are independent, but they might have sort of
Got it. A correlation.
Correlations, or you could imagine there being a pattern that is stored that has both of those things encoded in it.
Got it.
Right? So it has like, oh, here's a layout pattern that also corresponds to this meaning pattern. The layout part and the meaning part are independent, but you also encode them together such that it has this interesting effect. So that happens also. Yeah.
Got it. And what are you currently researching, Neil?
What am I currently researching?
Yeah.
Well, I have a grant that I received earlier this year that is about cross-cultural variation in what I would call visual languages. So, so a lot of my work recently has kind of targeted the idea that visual sequencing and comics and visual storytelling is sort of universal in a learning independent way, and and universal also kind of implies a lack of variability across types, that there's no real systematic types. And I've had been targeting this for a while, and I have a book coming out in November that has a preliminary analysis of this cross-culturally, but also really goes into research on, at what age do kids start understanding a sequence of images? Are there people around the world who can't understand a sequence of images? And the answer is yes. Are there, various clinical conditions like autism and schizophrenia and stuff like that, where they have, do those people have trouble with understanding sequence of images? And the answer is also yes. So it's this kind of aspect of fluency, and where does that come from? So that was the kind of topic of my book, but then we're carrying this much further in my grant project. So what we're doing is building a software program that will allow us to easier annotate visual information in comics, where you can visually select the information in the representation and then annotate it with whatever classifications you want. In our case, I have quite a lot of classifications for things. So we're building, the software is kind of half built at this point. We're hoping to have it ready by like January or so. And then the intent is to annotate 1,500 comics from around the world, and then do kind of cross-cultural linguistic sort of research, where you look at how patterns differ across cultures, and look at how, whether there are common sort of binding principles. So maybe it's like, well, when this thing here is of high proportions, maybe this is low. So we see, for example, a trade-off in what I call information density. So typically in languages, the more complex the word units are, the simpler the grammar is. And if you have very complex words units that are very dense in information, usually the grammatical structure is a bit simpler. So you have this kind of trade-off between what we call morphology and grammar for where the information, how the information is getting conveyed. Is it conveyed by unit or by sequence? Kind of a trade-off. And we've already shown signs that this happens in visual sequencing also. So the more dense the panels are, the more simple the grammatical structures are across panels, and vice versa. So like European comics typically pack a lot of information into each panel, and they seem to have simpler sequencing methods. Japanese comics tend to have a lot less information per panel, a lot more panels with single characters or zoomed in information, but they use a lot more of these complex modifiers and things like that in the grammatical structures. So that's like one example, and we're looking at quite a number of different kind of fields like this to look at these sort of cross-cultural, underlying patterns, and then to also look and see if these sorts of patterns might connect to the languages that are spoken by the creators of these comics. So are comics produced in India, spoken by Hindi speakers, reflective somehow of patterns in the Hindi language, or Punjabi, or etc., right? Do the spoken languages influence the visual languages, right? Our Japanese manga, is there something about the Japanese language that is then influencing the way they draw the comics? And there a comparison would be something like, if you look at the quote unquote manga that is drawn by Americans, so they use the Japanese visual language, but is there properties of that end up being different because they are not Japanese speakers, right? And so they have slightly different preferences for certain things. So those are the sorts of questions that we're asking about sort of cross-cultural patterning and the role of fluency and language and spoken languages influencing those sorts of connections.
Fascinating. If nothing else, we'd love to support in any way on this research.
Thank you.
If it's sharing many comic collections or being part of any surveys or helping you with annotating the visuals or translations.
Well, we'd love all of that. Anything that you can offer would be great. Oh, and I also forgot to mention. So we're doing all this. We're doing all this stuff about the cross-cultural patterns, but then we're also going to run experiments on those patterns and see if people who speak these different languages then respond to patterns in different ways in the visuals, or do people who read certain types of comics have preferences for comics that have those patterns, that sort of thing, right? So do readers of manga process the patterns found in manga versus the patterns found in American books in different ways? That sort of idea. If you have comics from India that you are willing to share, I'm always open to those ones, or anything like that. We would love any sort of help.
Definitely, and we'll in fact, as we find more, we'll share. And if there's anything specific that you're looking for, we'd love to send those.
Thank you.
What I also got out of this discussion was the possibility of templatizing the panels and the sequencing. So that's something I'd love for us to experiment. What I'll do is maybe once we at least make sketches of this, I'd love your input on if we're going in the right direction, if we're missing something basic. Could we share those with you for inputs?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm happy to help. So I would say, I'm happy to help out with something like that.
Fabulous. What I'll do is, this is more to put pressure on ourselves. Let me set a timeline that, say, in 2 weeks, at the very least, we'll share with you a quick summary of what we're going to do in this space. Just a document, an outline saying this is the direction we're going to go. Like I said, this is more for us to make sure that we get there.
Sure thing.
As we actually progress and start generating some of the stuff, it's all going to be on our website and it's going to be open source. So I'll share the links with you, and any inputs will be very helpful.
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to help.
Thank you so much, Neil. Richard?
Sure. Any other questions while you have me here?
I think the one on templates was very useful, because when at least I think of templates, I've been thinking around storylines. I haven't thought much on the areas that you are focusing on, and so when you were mentioning that got me to think sequencing. When I read Benjamin's papers, I see these sort of your influence over there. I guess Benjamin's teams, they focus a lot on the visual elements, the graphical elements, and the way they are sequenced to narrate the story in comic form, while we have focused mostly on comic characters. And I don't need to find a sweet spot. So,
yeah. And let me add also, with the sequencing parts, it's not just that it's sequencing of like the whole thing. Think about it, you can also think about it as chunks. So like this section follows a certain, arc or whatever, and then this next section, it can even be within the same page. Yes. You have different sections that each have their own templates. Yes. Right? That's another way to think about it. Yeah.
This has been really, time well spent. This is something which we've been looking forward to for a long time. I think a year or two ago, when I hit upon your Berkeley lecture, and that was fascinating. That was when I got hooked on, and then your website, and
Oh, well, thank you.
So this is something for us.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm glad you reached out and didn't delay even further. So I'm happy to help.
Thank you so much, Neil. Have a good
No
day.
problem.
Thank you so much.
We'll be in touch.
Great. Have a nice
Bye.
day. Bye.
Bye-bye.